We're just running a little bit late, Bevan, but we're very pleased that you've been able to both attend a congress halfway around the world and appreciate the initiative, the fact that you did take the initiative to attend this with IPAN's support and as an IPAN representative. And the title of Bevan's talk tonight is Neutrality Would Keep Us Out of a US-China War. And I might just add, for anyone who doesn't know, Bevan has been a founding member of IPAN and served on the CC for quite a number of years. And as I said earlier, he is our editor of Voice. Over to you, Bevan. And you're muted, Bevan.
That's pretty fundamental. Okay. Thank you, Annette, and good evening, everyone. I wish to acknowledge firstly that I'm speaking from the unceded lands of the Gadigal people of the Aurora Nation, and I pay my respects to their elders past and present and to their culture and civilisation. I also acknowledge that Australia, as we know it, is a British colonial construct which, starting in 1788, brutally dispossessed the Indigenous people of this continent of their land and sought to wipe out their identity and culture to an extent that approached genocide. In 1948, British colonialism supported another colonial construct, just as brutal, in Palestine, establishing the Zionist State of Israel and dispossessing the Indigenous Palestinian people of their land, suppressing and oppressing the Palestinian people to an extent approaching genocide, as we are witnessing every day in reports from Gaza. This Zionist state is strongly supported politically and militarily by the United States, and indeed could not exist without that support. Today in Australia, we are constrained by the remnants of the British colonial construct, with our subservient Prime Minister and Cabinet Ministers swearing allegiance to a foreign king, and our Defence Forces swearing to defend the British King and his realm. The British ensured that their appointee, the Governor-General, was answerable to the British King and had the reserve power in the Constitution to dismiss a democratically elected government, which he did in 1975. Australia's dominant leadership also adopts a subservient position to the United States, not simply allowing, but facilitating that country's tightening grip on Australia militarily, politically, and economically. We could say that Australia has become a United States neo-colonial construct. Australia's grovelling political leadership has tied us to US foreign policy through the AUKUS War Pact and ANZUS externally, and the Force Posture Agreement internally, to the extent that it appears inevitable that Australia would follow the US into a war against China, our major trading partner, a war which could turn into a nuclear catastrophe for us all. That's some introduction, but this is the domestic political backdrop which I contemplated when attending and speaking at the Colombian Congress on Neutrality. It was held in Bogota, the capital of Colombia. It is situated high up in the Andes on a plateau 2,500 metres above sea level. Bogota has a population of 12 million in a country with a population of 50 million. The primary organisers of the Congress were World Beyond War and the International Peace Bureau. The Congress call was for the world to unite for neutrality and peace and promote a strategy to stabilise our planet and build a future where war is a relic of the past. The two-day Congress involved 50 speakers from 5 continents and 25 countries. I spoke on behalf of IPAN and was the only Australian delegate. The Congress was held in a venue within the Republic of Colombia's Congress building, which is their parliament. We were addressed by 4 senators at the opening breakfast meeting within that building. And on the second day, we met the Vice President of Colombia, Francia Marquez, who spoke to us about her position on neutrality. Whilst she endorsed the Congress's desire for peace worldwide and a strategy for pursuing peace, she did raise some criticism of neutrality as such. The particular criticism deserves our attention as we in IPAN are considering the principle of non-nuclear armed neutrality in our IPAN vision for an alternative defence for an independent Australia. The concern is that neutrality could be taken to mean isolationism, washing one's hands of world's problems, turning one's back on injustices in the world. The Vice President said we cannot turn our backs on the suffering of the people of Gaza, for example. Contributions to the Congress showed that there are a number of approaches to neutrality. Some are isolationist, but most practice an active version of neutrality, keeping their military out of foreign wars, but working to promote peace in their region and acting as mediators in disputes. It also became clear that neutrality can be considered one of the tools in a country's foreign policy toolbox. It can be used for particular situations, but doesn't necessarily have to be a permanent policy, although some countries have adopted neutrality permanently. Whether it should be adopted permanently or not, I see neutrality as being vital for the Australian people at this time in our history. I see neutrality offering Australia a foreign policy alternative which would keep us safe and out of a US-China war. Non-nuclear armed neutrality is the basis of an alternative defence policy for Australia proposed by IPAN. In that policy, diplomacy is emphasised as the first line of defence in all situations. Diplomacy first. The ADF is confined to true self-defence of Australian territory and its surrounding waters out to the 200 nautical mile exclusive economic zone. There would be no involvement in foreign wars of aggression, and overseas deployment of our ADF would be restricted to joining United Nations peacekeeping forces in appropriate circumstances. Such a policy of territorial defence would be far less expensive than Australia's current focus on preparing for overseas wars against China, for example, in close integration with the United States. Defence analysts now say that recent technological advances, such as those involving drones and remote sensing, have made territorial self-defence based on area denial a much cheaper option than forward expeditionary aggressive wars in distant locations. Current defence policy has Australia poised to increase spending on war preparations to 2.4 of the gross domestic product by 2034, in a decade. The AUKUS expenditure of $368 billion on nuclear propelled hunter-killer submarines being only part of that. Defence Minister Miles has no trouble finding billions of dollars for hypersonic missile development and for equipping our frigates with Tomahawk cruise missiles designed for use against land-based targets, whilst the country is crying out for affordable housing, improved health care and urgent attention to addressing the climate emergency. IPAN's alternative defence policy based on neutrality has found support in the Australian community and deserves serious discussion. 2 national opinion polls conducted in 2023 by the Lowy Institute and Essential Research have found that a majority of Australians are in favour of keeping out of a US war on China and adopting a neutral position. The Lowy poll showed that 73% of Australian women favour this position. So what exactly is neutrality and how would it work? We should note that 20 countries have adopted a neutrality policy. Austria, for example, practices non-aligned neutrality. It does not host foreign military forces or bases and has its own self-defence force. It does not participate in foreign wars and has no military alliances. Its parliament adopted the neutrality law, which has become part of its constitution. It hosts international meetings, has banned nuclear weapons, and played a part in Central Europe becoming nuclear-free. The Congress Speaker for Austria was Dr. Heinz Gartner, Academic Director of the Austrian Institute for International Affairs. He said, "Neutrality avoids entanglement in great power wars. It also gives a neutral state the credibility to act as a buffer state, promote peacekeeping, host meetings between belligerents, and act as a mediator." This is an example of active neutrality. I think Austria provides a great example of how neutrality could work in and for Australia, and it shows how we could play a constructive role in our region and beyond in promotion of peaceful resolution to conflict and acting as a mediator in such conflicts. So what is preventing Australia adopting a foreign policy based on neutrality, which is in line with the wishes of the majority of Australians? Now, we know this. The basic problem is that Australia's political leadership has been totally captured by the United States and slavishly follows US foreign policy through the ANZUS alliance and more recently, the AUKUS war pact between the UK, the US and Australia. Internally, this subservience to the US is expressed through the wholesale sellout of sovereignty resulting from the Force Posture Agreement signed by the US and Australian governments in 2014. The FPA guarantees the United States a military posture in Australia. It gives the United States military unimpeded access to our airports and seaports. This includes porting of their nuclear submarines at HMAS Stirling in WA and basing of their nuclear-capable B-52 bombers at RAAF Tyndall in the Northern Territory. It facilitates the stationing in Darwin of 2,500 US Marines each year and the staging of military exercises with our ADF in preparation for a war against China. The US has also established its own command centres in Darwin for its Air Force and Marines. Then there is the Pine Gap Spy Station near Alice Springs, which feeds the US military strategic information from its satellite surveillance of the Earth's surface and its capture and analysis of radio communications, including that from mobile phones. Professor Richard Tanter, an expert on the expanded role of Pine Gap, recently stated that the strategic information which Pine Gap supplies to the US is passed on to the Israeli military for use in its war of genocide against the people of Gaza. Summing up, clearly neutrality is not an option until our continent is cleared of foreign military installations, which would otherwise compromise our neutrality in a time of war. This is the message to the Australian people. Only a massive, broad-based, united and very public movement can clear the ground for the adoption of a political solution which will keep us safe and out of foreign wars, namely non-nuclear armed neutrality. Thank you.